You want us to believe a man who smells like motor oil is a two-star general? Sir, I've heard some tall tales in this precinct, but that one might win a prize. That was the first thing, Sergeant Roy Blevins said to Elijah Carter. Loud enough that 6 officers turned to look. Loud enough that a woman filing a noise complaint, 2 counters down, stopped mid-sentence to watch. Elijah did not answer right away. He set his coffee-stained folder on the counter, folded his weathered hands over it, and waited, the way a man waits when he has already decided the outcome does not depend on how fast he speaks. Let's go back 4 minutes before that, to the moment Elijah Carter pushed open the door of the Millbrook Falls Police Department, a squat, brick building on Route 9 outside Asheville, North Carolina, where the ceiling fan turned so slow it barely stirred the smell of burnt coffee and printer toner. It was 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of afternoon where the heat sits heavy even with the season turning. Cicadas still going strong out past the parking lot, the asphalt shimmering faint through the front windows. A few mismatched plastic chairs lined the waiting area, one missing an armrest, and a bulletin board behind the counter carried a curling flyer about a neighborhood watch meeting nobody had attended in months, and a photograph of a lost beagle nobody had ever found. Elijah was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, his skin a deep, sun-worn brown, his flannel shirt soft from 100 washes, a small tear mended with green thread at the left cuff. He drove a 2009 Chevy Silverado with 214,000 miles on it, parked crooked in the second spot because the first was blocked by an orange cone. Nobody had moved in months. He had come for one reason only. His wallet had been lifted outside the Piggly Wiggly on Tunnel Road that morning, and inside it had been his driver's license, $43, and a small brass compass that had belonged to his father. He needed a police report so the DMV would reissue his license. That was all. He was not looking for anything else, and nothing about the folder tucked under his arm suggested he was carrying anything more dramatic than paperwork. But paperwork, it turned out, was exactly the problem. Remember that folder. It will matter more than anyone in that lobby could have guessed. Elijah Carter had lived in Millbrook Falls for 11 years, in a small house on Pine Hollow Road, with a porch he'd rebuilt himself the summer after his wife, Rosalind, died. Every morning at 5:40, before the sun cracked over the ridge, he walked 2 miles down to the Waffle Barn on Route 9, ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, dry toast, black coffee, and left the same tip, $4 folded under the saucer, whether the bill was $9 or $19. The waitress there, a 22-year-old named Dana Puit, who was saving for nursing school, had stopped asking why an old man in a faded flannel shirt tipped like that. She'd simply started saving him the corner booth, the one with the good light, without being asked. Nobody in Millbrook Falls knew that Elijah Carter had spent 31 years in the United States Army, that he had commanded a brigade in 2 wars, that his shoulder still carried a puckered scar from a piece of shrapnel outside Kandahar in 2009, or that the Pentagon still kept a line open, day and night, in case a man like him ever needed it. He had never told anyone. Not the mailman, not the pharmacist, not even Dana, who refilled his coffee 3 times a week and knew the names of his grandchildren, but not his rank. His son, Marcus Jr., had asked him once over a Sunday dinner 2 years back why he never mentioned it. The stars, the ceremonies, the folded flag his own father had once received at a funeral in 1974 for a brother lost in Vietnam. Elijah had set his fork down slowly, the way he set most things down, and said that his father had spent 30 years being looked past by men who assumed a black man in work boots couldn't have earned anything worth respecting, and that watching that happen had taught him something no ceremony ever could. That the medals didn't make the man, and a man who needed them to be seen had already lost something more important than rank. He carried his father's compass in his coat pocket, for that exact reason, not as decoration, but as a reminder that dignity had to be able to stand on its own, in a flannel shirt, in a rusted truck, in a room where nobody knew his name. His son Marcus Jr., a hospital administrator 2 hours away in Charlotte, would call that Tuesday evening, the moment the story reached his phone through a cousin's frantic text, his voice shaking in a way Elijah had heard maybe 3 times in 30 years. Elijah would tell him, calmly, that he was fine, that it was already handled, and that there was no need to drive up that night. Marcus Jr. would drive up, anyway, arriving past midnight, standing in his father's kitchen with his coat still on, needing to see for himself that the man who'd taught him to shake hands firm and speak plain was actually standing there, unshaken, pouring 2 cups of coffee at 11 at night, like it was any other Tuesday. That was still hours away, though. That afternoon, nobody in Elijah's life knew anything was wrong yet. That was why the folder in his hands that Tuesday afternoon held no medals for show. Inside were 3 items only: his laminated retired officer identification card, edges gone soft from 3 decades in a wallet pocket, a single photograph of Rosalind on their porch, laughing at something out of frame, and folded beneath both, a single sheet of Department of Defense letterhead confirming his emergency contact authorization. The kind of document that meant almost nothing to a man behind a counter who didn't know what he was looking at, and meant everything to the system behind him. He had never once needed to explain that folder to a stranger. Today, for the first time in 11 years, he was about to. There was one more thing about Elijah Carter that mattered, and it had nothing to do with medals. Every Thursday, without fail, he drove the Silverado 40 minutes to the VA hospital in Asheville and sat with men half his age who had come home from Iraq and Afghanistan with pieces of themselves left behind, not always pieces you could see. He never told them his rank. He introduced himself simply as Elijah, poured the coffee, and listened. A nurse there, a woman named Priya Anand, who had watched hundreds of visitors come and go, once asked him why he never mentioned that he'd commanded men in combat himself, why he let a 19-year-old private assume he was just some retired mechanic with time on his hands. Elijah had told her that the moment a young man in a wheelchair found out he was talking to a general, the conversation stopped being 2 soldiers and started being a performance, and he'd had enough of performances by then to last 2 lifetimes. He wanted, he said, to be listened to, and to listen back as nothing more than a man who understood what silence after gunfire sounds like. That was the version of Elijah Carter that walked into the Millbrook Falls Police Department that Tuesday, not a general seeking recognition, but a private citizen's who had spent 30 years deliberately practicing the discipline of being ordinary, because he had decided, long before anyone in that building was born, that the measure of a life was never going to be found in how loudly it announced itself. Sergeant Roy Blevins had worked the front desk of the Millbrook Falls Police Department for 9 years, and in that time he had built a reputation among the younger officers as a man who could smell a liar the second they walked through the door. He was proud of that instinct. He talked about it at the diner, at church, at his daughter's soccer games. How you could tell everything about a person from the first 6 seconds. The shoes, the truck, the way they held eye contact, the particular set of a man's jaw when he was hiding something. Younger officers took notes, more or less literally. Danny Ruiz kept a running joke that Blevins should teach a class on it at the academy. What Blevins never said out loud, because he had never once examined it closely enough to say it, was that his instinct worked a little too well on people who looked like Elijah Carter, and a little too generously on people who didn't. 3 weeks earlier, a college student named Tyler Fenwick had come in reeking of bourbon at 10 in the morning, slurring through an account of a fender bender he swore wasn't his fault, driving a car worth more than most houses on Pine Hollow Road. and Blevins had waved him through with a laugh and a joke about frat parties, never once asking him to blow into anything. A month before that, a well-dressed contractor had walked in, claiming a permit dispute that turned out on the mildest inspection to be an outright fabrication meant to intimidate a competitor. And Blevins had shaken the man's hand on the way out and told him good luck. Nobody remembered either of those afternoons. Nobody was ever going to write either of them up. Everybody, eventually, was going to remember what happened to Elijah Carter, because some afternoons simply refuse to stay quiet, no matter how ordinary they look walking through the door. When Elijah reached the counter, Blevins was mid-conversation with Officer Danny Ruiz about a fantasy football trade, and he made Elijah wait a full 90 seconds without so much as a glance, not out of procedure, but because some old habit told him a man in a truck like that had nowhere better to be. When he finally turned, his eyes moved over Elijah in the practiced sweep of a man cataloging threat level. The flannel, the boots scuffed pale at the toe, the truck visible through the window with a NC plate gone rusty at the corners. Something in that sweep decided, before a single word was spoken, that this was not a man Blevins needed to take seriously. Elijah explained, evenly, that his wallet had been stolen that morning, outside the Piggly Wiggly, along with his license and a small brass compass, and that he needed a report filed. Blevins asked, more out of boredom than duty, what was in the folder. Elijah opened it without hesitation, because he had spent 61 years believing that a man with nothing to hide had no reason to act like he did. Blevins picked up the laminated identification card, turned it over once, and went very still. The particular stillness of a man deciding whether to laugh in someone's face. Then he laughed anyway. He held the card up over his head like a prize at a county fair, and called out to the bullpen that the gentleman standing at the counter claimed to be a 2-star general. And would everyone please stand for the national anthem? Officer Ruiz nearly fell out of his chair laughing. 2 more officers drifted over from their desks, drawn by the sound the way people are drawn to a fender bender on the highway. Not because they wanted to see it, but because they couldn't help it. Elijah did not move. He did not reach for the folder. He watched 5 strangers pass his father's compass photograph and his late wife's face from hand to hand like a joke at a bar, and something in his jaw set, quiet and immovable, the way a door settles into its frame after it's been slammed one time too many. That was the first tier, and a kinder room might have let it end there. A bad joke, an apology, a report filed, and a man sent home. Instead, Blevins leaned across the counter, still holding the ID card, and said the line that would end up on a departmental review 6 weeks later, typed out in full. You want us to believe a man who smells like motor oil is a 2-star general. Sir, I've heard some tall tales in this precinct, but that one might win a prize. The bullpen laughed harder. A woman waiting to file a noise complaint, 2 counters down, stopped mid-sentence, phone half-raised, some instinct telling her this was worth remembering. Elijah asked quietly if someone could simply take his report about the stolen wallet so he could be on his way. Nobody answered him. That was the second tier. No longer a private misunderstanding, but a performance, staged now for an audience of a dozen strangers who had done nothing but watch. Detective Carl Dunmore joined them at that point, drawn over by the noise, and he was the one who tipped the room from cruel to dangerous. He picked up the brass compass from where it sat on the counter beside the folder, turned it over in his fingers like a man examining a garage sale trinket, and asked Elijah, with a smirk he didn't bother hiding, whether he'd stolen this too, or whether it came free with the costume. Something shifted in Elijah then. Not a flinch, nothing so visible as that, but a stillness that went 1 degree colder, the particular quiet of a man measuring exactly how much further he was willing to let this go before he stopped being patient and started being precise. He said, in a voice that had dropped half an octave, that the compass had belonged to his father, and he would appreciate it back in the folder. Dunmore held it a beat longer than necessary before setting it down, just to prove he could. The third tier arrived 7 minutes later, and it did not come as a joke. Blevins told Elijah that impersonating a military officer was a federal offense, that the department did not take it lightly, and that he would need to come around the counter with his hands, where they could be seen. Elijah asked, one final time, whether anyone in the building intended to simply file the report he'd walked in for. The question hung in the air a full 3 seconds. Long enough for the fluorescent light overhead to flicker once, long enough for the woman filing her noise complaint to lower her phone entirely, sensing the room had crossed into something she no longer wanted to film. Nobody answered him. 2 officers stepped forward. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not pull away. He turned, exhaled once through his nose, and let the cold steel close around wrists that had once carried a rifle through 2 deployments, while Dana Pruitt's tip jar sat forgotten in his coat pocket, and his father's compass rode along in the dark, silent as it had been for 40 years. An elderly woman near the entrance, waiting on a permit renewal, pressed her lips into a thin line and looked away, the particular look of someone who has watched this exact scene unfold before, in one town or another, more times than she wanted to count. Nobody in that lobby said a word on Elijah's behalf. He did not expect them to. He understood, better than most, how quickly a room full of ordinary people could become an audience for someone else's cruelty without ever once deciding to be. The interrogation room was small, and the color of old dishwater. One table bolted to the concrete floor, a camera blinking red in the corner like it was keeping score. Blevins sat across from Elijah, alongside Dunmore, and for the next 40 minutes they took turns asking Elijah to explain, in detail, where he'd obtained the identification and what he intended to do with it. Elijah answered each question exactly once, in the same even voice, and then went quiet. Dunmore leaned back in his chair and remarked, almost gently, that men tried this more often than people realized. Buying a costume badge online, wearing it around town, hoping for a free coffee or a discount at the hardware store, hoping nobody would ever check. Blevins slid a legal pad across the table and told Elijah that if he simply admitted the whole thing was an exaggeration, a bit of harmless embellishment, this could all end quietly with a warning instead of a charge. It was, in its way, the cruelest offer of the entire afternoon, an invitation for a man who had commanded a brigade under fire to sit in a room and lie about his own life just to make 2 strangers comfortable again. Elijah looked at the pad for a long moment. He did not pick up the pen. The silence that followed lasted 11 full seconds. Long enough that Dunmore's knee started bouncing under the table, long enough that the camera's red light seemed to blink slower, long enough that even Blevins, for the briefest instant, felt something crack loose in his certainty and quickly buried it. Elijah finally said that he had nothing to admit to, because he had told them the truth from the first sentence, and that the only thing he intended to keep repeating was his request to file a stolen property report. Dunmore tapped his pen against the pad, rephrasing the same accusation in slightly different words, as though rewording a lie about a man might eventually make it true. Near the door, a young officer named Grace Whitfield stood with her arms crossed, watching. She was 26, 11 months on the job, and she had noticed something the others hadn't. The way Elijah's spine stayed perfectly straight, even in a plastic chair, the way his eyes tracked the room like a man cataloging exits out of old habit rather than fear, the way his hands, folded on the table, never once trembled, even as 2 grown men tried to talk him into confessing to a lie. She thought briefly about saying something, about asking Dunmore to slow down, to double-check the badge number before anyone said the word federal offense out loud in a room with a camera running. Her mouth had actually opened once, the beginning of a sentence forming, "Sir, maybe we should just," before she closed it again. She had transferred to Millbrook Falls 4 months earlier, from a department 2 counties over that had let her go for insubordination. After she'd questioned a traffic stop she thought was unfair, and the words still sat in her personnel file like a scar nobody could see but her. She needed this job the way a person needs a roof that doesn't leak. So she stayed quiet, arms crossed a little tighter, and told herself that watching carefully counted for something, even as some honest part of her understood it didn't. Not really, not yet. It was Dana Prejudice, 300 yards away, at the waffle barn, who did something. She noticed Elijah hadn't shown up for his 5:40 breakfast vals the next morning. The first missed morning in 11 years. The corner booth sitting empty under the good light while his coffee went cold in the pot behind the counter. And when a regular mentioned overhearing something about the old vet getting hauled in at the station, Dana didn't hesitate. She untied her apron mid-shift, ignored her manager calling after her, and grabbed her phone from her locker with hands that weren't quite steady. She dialed a number Elijah had given her 2 years earlier, folded onto a napkin, in case of emergencies, nothing more, probably never need it. She almost hadn't kept the napkin. She left a message that would reach exactly the right desk 4 hours later, a message that began, "Simply, my friend Elijah is in trouble and nobody at that station knows who he really is." She had no power to change what was happening inside that gray room. But she had a phone, and a memory, and the stubbornness to use both. And sometimes, that turns out to be enough to light the fuse. Back at his terminal, Blevins ran Elijah's fingerprints, expecting a minute's wait and a name that matched nothing, maybe a string of minor offenses that would confirm everything he'd already decided in the first 6 seconds of that afternoon. Instead, the screen returned a single red line: access restricted, clearance level insufficient. He blinked, assumed it was a glitch, and ran it again, typing more slowly this time, double-checking every digit. The second attempt froze the screen for 4 long seconds before locking him out entirely, forcing a full restart from the login screen. He sat there a moment, the hum of the building suddenly louder in his ears, the bullpen's earlier laughter already starting to feel. Somewhere underneath his certainty, like it belonged to a different, easier afternoon. He called over the department's IT contractor, a wiry man named Sam Okafor, who studied the error and told him flatly that he'd only seen a lock like that twice before in 11 years on the job. Both times, it meant the file belonged to someone whose record sat sealed above local, county, and even state access, filed under a classification most municipal terminals weren't even built to display. Blevins muttered that it had to be a malfunction because there was no version of reality where a man in a torn flannel shirt sitting in holding cell 2 had a file locked behind federal clearance. Sam didn't answer him. He just looked at the screen a second longer than he needed to, and something in that silence said more than an answer would have. Down the hall, Elijah sat in that cell without complaint, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on a thin rectangle of light coming through the high window. He had spent enough years in briefing rooms and command tents to recognize the particular silence of people beginning to sense they'd made a mistake, long before they were ready to admit it out loud. He did not call out. He did not ask again. He simply waited, the way he had waited through long nights overseas, trusting that certain systems, once triggered, moved forward on their own schedule, regardless of what any single sergeant in a small-town station believed about a man's truck or his shirt. That was layer 1. The document the system itself refused to open. At around that same hour, a federal agent named Thomas Whitaker happened to walk into the station on unrelated business, delivering paperwork for a separate investigation his office was running in the county. Passing the holding area, he glanced through the small, wire-reinforced window in the door and stopped mid-stride. Something about the stillness of the man inside, snagging at a memory he couldn't immediately place. A particular way of holding the shoulders, of sitting with the spine straight, even when no one was watching, that reminded him of officers he'd been briefed by early in his own career. Men who carried a room with them wherever they sat. He turned to ask a passing officer who the man was. But before he got a full answer, Captain Louise Ferris stepped out of her office and told everyone, a touch too quickly, that the situation was already being handled. Whitaker had a schedule to keep and no formal authority over a local matter, so he continued down the hallway. But the feeling followed him out to his car, and he found himself glancing back at the building twice before he finally pulled out of the lot. At 6:50 that evening, Elijah asked for the third time for his phone call. Captain Ferris, worn down by an afternoon of strangeness she couldn't explain, a message already sitting unheard on her desk phone from a waffle barn waitress she'd never met, finally allowed it, mostly to prove to herself that nothing would come of it. She stood arms crossed in the hallway as Elijah dialed a number from memory, waited 3 rings, and spoke 6 words that landed in a different register than anything the department had heard from him all day: his name, his rank, and an authentication sequence, Delta 79, before falling silent, listening. On the other end, a young operator at a Department of Defense duty desk 400 miles away went rigid mid-sentence, placed the call on hold without a word of explanation, and paged a superior without waiting to be asked twice. Captain Ferris watched the silence stretch for nearly a full minute. No dial tone, no voice, just Elijah standing with the receiver against his ear, patient as a man who already knew exactly what was coming. And it was that silence, more than anything spoken, that planted the first real seed of dread in her chest. Elijah hung up without another word, thanked her quietly, and let himself be led back to the cell, his expression unreadable, as though he already understood precisely what came next, and felt no need to hurry it along. That was layer 2. Confirmation from an authority no one in that building could argue with. 10 minutes later, the department's dedicated federal line. An old beige phone that sat untouched in Captain Ferris's office for months at a stretch began to ring with a sharp, insistent tone that made every officer within earshot go quiet. Ferris answered it standing up. She said, "Yes, sir," 4 times in 90 seconds, and did not sit back down once. When she hung up, her face had lost whatever color the afternoon's confusion had left in it. And she walked out into the bullpen and told every officer present, in a voice that cracked once in the middle, to stand by, because they had a convoy inbound within the hour. 40 minutes after that, headlights swept across the station's front windows in a pattern too disciplined to be coincidence. 2 black military police vehicles rolled to a stop first, followed by a pair of dark government SUVs, their doors opening in near-perfect unison as uniformed personnel stepped onto the pavement without a single wasted motion. A final vehicle arrived moments later, and from it emerged a tall man in dress uniform, insignia catching the last orange light of the day. He crossed the lot without hesitation and pushed through the glass doors with the calm of someone who had walked into far more dangerous rooms than this one. Every officer who happened to glance through the front windows felt the same wave pass through them at once. The sudden, undeniable understanding that whatever was coming was no longer a possibility, but an arriving certainty. He introduced himself as Lieutenant General Harold Whitmore, and he asked, in a voice that required no volume to carry, to be taken immediately to General Elijah Carter. Captain Ferris led the way, apologizing before she'd finished forming a full sentence. When the holding cell door opened, Elijah rose slowly, calm, almost gentle, as though the day had cost him nothing at all. General Whitmore stepped forward and rendered a full, formal salute. Elijah returned it with the same quiet steadiness he'd carried since 2:14 that afternoon. That was layer 3. The one nobody in that building could argue away. The moment their own eyes confirmed what the system and the phone call already had. Whitmore turned to the room. More than 20 officers, some still mid-paperwork, straightened instinctively as he ordered the entire unit to attention. And then, in a voice that carried to every corner of the building, instructed every officer present to render General Carter the salute that should have greeted him the moment he'd walked through their doors that afternoon. The order landed like a physical blow across the bullpen. Hands rose across the station in near unison. Danny Ruiz, Carl Dunmore, a dozen others whose names Elijah would never learn, years of instinctive discipline overriding whatever shame was still churning underneath. All except Sergeant Roy Blevins, who stood frozen near the counter, his hand halfway raised, staring at the identification card sitting exactly where he'd left it that afternoon. The same laminated card he had once held over his head like a party trick while the whole room laughed along with him. His hand would not finish the motion. Something in his arm simply refused, caught between 9 years of certainty and the plain, unbearable fact standing 3 feet away from him in dress uniform. Grace Whitfield saluted with her jaw tight and her eyes wet, ashamed of the silence she'd kept in that gray room, promising herself in that instant, silently, fiercely, that she would never keep a silence like that again as long as she wore the uniform. Elijah stood amid the sea of raised hands, unassuming, and after a long moment lifted his own hand in a brief, understated return. A man far more interested in the moment ending than in savoring it. He said nothing. He offered no speech, no declaration of vindication. He simply lowered his hand and crossed the room to gather his folder. Still sitting untouched on the front counter, exactly where this entire afternoon had begun, the photograph of Rosalind and the brass compass tucked back inside where they belonged. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken could have, settling over the station like a verdict. Everyone in the room already understood, whether or not it had been said aloud yet. The review that followed took 11 weeks, and it did not stop at Roy Blevins. A team from the Department of Defense's Inspector General's office, working alongside the county prosecutor, pulled 6 months of intake logs and found a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone with enough authority to actually look. 3 prior complaints against Blevins alone, each one involving a Black or Latino resident, detained on what the file called identity concerns that had, every single time, turned out to be nothing at all. A mechanic accused of driving a truck too nice for his paycheck, a nurse questioned twice in 1 year over a name investigators later admitted they'd simply never bothered running properly the first time. One of those men, a retired schoolteacher named Otis Reams, had spent 4 hours in a holding cell that spring over a vehicle registration the system had flagged as suspended. A registration that was, in fact, current, a clerical error nobody had checked because nobody had felt the need to. He had never filed a formal complaint. He'd gone home that night, told his wife it wasn't worth the trouble, and taught his 6th grade civics class the following Monday like nothing had happened, because he hadn't believed, not for 1 second, that anyone in a position to fix it would actually listen to a man like him. When investigators reopened his file that October and called him in to review what they'd found, he sat across the table from 2 DOD attorneys and wept, not from relief exactly, but from the plain, disorienting fact that someone, finally, after all this time, had checked. Blevins was called before the Departmental Review Board on the 2nd Tuesday of November, in a room 3 doors down from the same briefing room, where Elijah would later stand and forgive them all. Even then, staring at body cam footage of himself, holding a laminated ID card over his head like a carnival trophy, a locked federal terminal log, and the sworn statement of a 2-star general, he did not apologize. He leaned forward, jaw tight, and said he'd been doing his job the way he'd always done it. that the system had let him down by not flagging Elijah's file sooner, that no reasonable officer could be blamed for trusting his own eyes in a case like this one. When one of the board members asked him directly whether he would have made the same 9-second judgment about a man who arrived in a suit and a newer car, Blevins hesitated for the first time all afternoon, and then answered that he couldn't say, which the board member wrote down, word for word, in the official minutes. It was that refusal, not the joke, not the handcuffs, not even the laughter, that the board cited as the deciding factor in his termination. Had Captain Ferris, reading the decision aloud, in a voice that did not waver, told him plainly that 31 years of a man's discipline hadn't been the thing on trial that day. His own 9 years of deciding, in 6 seconds or less, who deserved to be believed. That was what the board had weighed, and found wanting beyond repair. Blevins walked out of the building that afternoon with a cardboard box under one arm, and no words for anyone, past a front desk he would never sit behind again. And Millbrook Falls, a town of 11,000 people who all seemed to know each other's business within a week, made sure he understood exactly why through the letters column of the local paper for 3 weeks running. His daughter's soccer coach quietly stopped inviting him to Saturday sideline coffee. The diner where he'd told his 6 second instinct stories for 9 years grew a little colder toward him, nobody saying anything directly, everybody somehow saying it anyway. Carl Dunmore was suspended 60 days without pay and required to complete a full year of supervised bias retraining before returning to any customer-facing post. He took it in stark silence, and colleagues noted that he never picked up another man's personal belongings off a counter again without asking first. Grace Whitfield kept her job. The review board noted, almost gently, that she'd been the only one in that gray room who'd looked uneasy the entire time, the only one whose body cam audio caught her starting a sentence she never finished. And she asked, on her own, to be assigned to co-lead the department's new intake procedure training, so that the silence she'd carried out of that room would never again be the only thing she had to show for a day, like that one. Elijah, for his part, asked for none of it. He declined the department's offer of a public apology ceremony, turned down a proposed settlement, and made one request only: that no criminal charges be filed against Danny Ruiz or the other junior officers who had laughed but never touched him, because punishment without change, he said, rarely taught a man anything worth keeping. He agreed to one meeting, held in the same briefing room, where the department reviewed shift schedules and traffic patterns, its walls lined with faded county maps that had watched ordinary afternoons pass beneath them, and it felt entirely different that day, charged with a solemnity none of the officers filing in had expected to carry into such an ordinary space. A younger officer, near the back, one who had said little during the entire review process, finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had clearly been sitting on more than a few minds since the convoy first pulled into the lot. He asked why Elijah had never simply said who he was, why he'd let himself be laughed at, handcuffed, questioned for hours, when a single sentence about his rank could have ended it before it started. Elijah considered the question for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than bitter, and told the young officer that rank had never been the thing that gave a man his worth. Stars on a shoulder, medals in a folder, none of it meant anything if the character underneath couldn't stand on its own without the decoration. He said he had wanted, in some quiet way he hadn't fully understood himself until it was over, to see how this department treated ordinary citizens who arrived with nothing but the truth and a request for help, because that, more than any uniform or title, was the truest measure of an institution meant to serve everyone the same. The room stayed silent for a long stretch after that, officers glancing at one another, several visibly wrestling with a lesson none of them would be forgetting anytime soon. that the measure of a man had never once been found in an identification card, but in the steadiness with which he carried himself when nobody in the room believed he deserved it. It had. Word of what happened at the Millbrook Falls station traveled further than anyone in that building had expected. Carried first through official channels and then in fragments, through local papers that had picked up pieces of the story from officials who could no longer keep it fully contained. Reporters called from 3 different networks, each one hoping to land an interview with a decorated general wrongfully arrested and later vindicated by the full weight of the Pentagon. Elijah declined nearly every request. He granted exactly one conversation to a local journalist named Renata Cole, who had covered small-town stories in that county for almost 20 years and had never once, in all that time, encountered something of this scale. She later admitted the interview had felt less like sitting across from a war hero and more like sitting across from a man who was almost entirely unbothered by his own extraordinary history. More interested in the point he wanted to make than in the fact that people finally wanted to listen to him make it. He told her plainly that people ought to be careful about judging others by the truck they drove, or the state of the shirt on their back, because appearances revealed nothing true about a person's history, their sacrifices, or the quiet weight they carried without ever once complaining about it. Dignity, he said, wasn't something handed down by rank or title. It was something every person deserved the moment they walked through a door and asked plainly to be treated fairly. Any institution built to serve the public owed that much to every citizen equally, without a single exception carved out for what they happened to be wearing that day. At the VA hospital in Asheville, Priya Anand read the story on her phone during a break and sat very still for a long moment before showing it to 2 of the young veterans Elijah had been sitting with every Thursday for years. Neither of them had known. One of them, a 23-year-old named Cody Marsh, who'd lost most of the hearing in his left ear outside Kandahar and had spent 8 months barely speaking to anyone, read the article twice, then asked Priya, quietly, whether Elijah would still come on Thursday like always. Priya told him she was sure he would. He did, the very next Thursday, in the same flannel shirt, carrying the same coffee, sitting in the same chair, and when Cody asked him, hesitant whether it was true, Elijah simply nodded once and asked how Cody's physical therapy had gone that week. And that was the end of the conversation, exactly the way Elijah wanted it to be. 6 months later, on a cool March afternoon, Elijah walked back into that same station one final time. Not for a report, not for an apology, just to pick up a form for his renewed license. The building felt different, quieter. The officers who passed him in the hallway offered nods that carried actual weight now, not the practiced courtesy of people who'd been told to be polite. Near the entrance, Grace Whitfield straightened when she saw him and, without a word, offered a slow, deliberate salute, holding it a beat longer than protocol required. Elijah studied her face for a moment, the same young officer who'd stood silent by the door 6 months earlier, and this time he let himself smile, small and genuine, before returning the gesture with something that looked almost like warmth. He climbed into the old Silverado, the engine coughing twice before settling into its familiar rhythm, and pulled out past the orange cone nobody had ever moved, toward Pine Hollow Road, where Dana Puit would have his corner booth, waiting the next morning at 5:40, same as always, $4 folded under the saucer, whether the bill called for it or not. Somewhere past the edge of town, where Route 9 curves gentle toward the ridge, and the last light spills gold across the tobacco fields, Elijah rolled the window down halfway and let the cool March air move through the cab. His mind drifted, not to the handcuffs, or the mockery or the flashing red and blue of that gray afternoon, but to something simpler. Decades earlier, sitting on a porch 2 counties over, telling a much younger Elijah that a man's character was only ever measured in the moments nobody was watching. He had carried that lesson through 2 deployments and 100 quiet nights he never talked about, through medals pinned to his chest by men whose names history would remember, and through decades of choosing, deliberately, again and again, to be nothing more than ordinary. He carried it still, driving home in a truck with a dented fender and 214,000 miles on the odometer, his father's brass compass riding quiet in his coat pocket, wanting nothing from the world except the same thing he'd walked in asking for that Tuesday afternoon: to be treated, plainly and without conditions, like a man. The town, in its own imperfect way, had learned something that afternoon it wasn't going to forget anytime soon. Passed quietly from officer to officer, from parent to child at the dinner table, from one ordinary conversation at the waffle barn to the next, that the measure of a person could never be found in the truck they drove or the shirt on their back, but only in the steady, unseen decency they carried through a lifetime of days when nobody was keeping score. And somewhere out past the edge of Millbrook Falls, where the road curved gentle toward the ridge and the last light spilled gold across the fields, an old soldier drove home in peace, asking for nothing, owed everything, content simply to be, once again, just a man in a faded jacket heading home for supper. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, hit like so, it finds the person who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's ever been looked past because of what they were wearing or what they were driving. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in that room, and which side of the counter were you on? I read every single one.